In May of 1525, Frederick III of Saxony held a feast that lasted 4 days and ended with his death. The 62-year-old German prince was known for his insatiable appetite, but this final banquet pushed his body beyond what it could endure. After his death, physicians discovered that his stomach had ruptured from the sheer amount of undigested food. Frederick had literally eaten until his stomach burst, unable to stop even as his body began to fail. Born in 1463 into the House of Wettin, Frederick inherited control of Saxony, one of the most prosperous German territories within the Holy Roman Empire. The region's wealth flowed from silver mines and strategic trade routes, giving Frederick resources that few other German princes could match. His father Ernest had built a reputation for careful governance and diplomatic skill, but Frederick gravitated toward different pursuits from his earliest years. While his brothers trained in military strategy and studied statecraft, Frederick spent his time at banquets, developing a relationship with food that went far beyond typical aristocratic indulgence. The late 15th century had brought profound changes to European courts through the Renaissance. German princes now competed not just through military might but through displays of cultural sophistication and wealth. A ruler's table communicated power as clearly as an army. Frederick grasped this language of status instinctively. The court at Torgau drew attention throughout the empire for its elaborate feasts and the sheer volume of food consumed. Merchants traveling through Saxony marveled at the quantities of provisions entering the electoral palace, noting they had never seen such continuous demand for meat, wine, and delicacies. When Frederick took power in 1486, real administrative talent emerged. The mining wealth of Saxony was managed skillfully, productive relationships with neighboring territories were maintained, and the complex politics of the Holy Roman Empire were navigated with surprising finesse. The court attracted scholars and artists, creating an atmosphere of cultural achievement, but visitors quickly discovered that intellectual conversation mattered far less to Frederick than sharing his table. Over the years, consumption rather than scholarship or military prowess came to define the man's identity. The transformation from enthusiastic eater to compulsive glutton crept forward gradually across 2 decades. Celebratory feasts that once marked special occasions became weekly events, then daily rituals. The duration of meals stretched from a few hours to most of the day. Whole oxen arrived at the palace kitchens alongside dozens of geese, barrels of fish, wheels of cheese, and mountains of bread. The wine purchases alone would have sustained a small village. The cooking staff worked around the clock because the demand never ended. Their fires burned continuously, their ovens never cooled, their knives never rested. Frederick's body began broadcasting warnings that went unacknowledged. Weight climbed dramatically, pressing against the limits of specially made clothing. Walking from chambers to dining hall left the prince winded. Rising from a chair required visible effort. The court physician watched these changes with growing alarm and approached Frederick repeatedly with explanations rooted in medical knowledge inherited from ancient Greek physicians. The human stomach processes food through specific mechanisms that require time and capacity. Overwhelming these processes creates danger. The physician laid out these facts clearly, using diagrams and texts to support the warnings. Frederick listened with apparent attention, thanked the physician for his concern, and immediately ordered another course of venison and cream sauce. The nobility surrounding Frederick found themselves trapped between duty and physical endurance. Declining the prince's dinner invitation meant risking his displeasure and potentially damaging political relationships. Accepting meant subjecting themselves to marathon eating sessions that left even the hardiest courtiers groaning in discomfort and praying for release. Ambassadors from neighboring German territories described scenes that strained credibility. Frederick would begin eating and servants would bring food in an endless procession. The eating proceeded with focused determination, barely pausing between courses, attention locked entirely on the plates. Conversation died because no interest was shown in it. When courtiers attempted to excuse themselves, pleading they could eat no more, Frederick would turn his gaze on them with a mixture of confusion and anger that made his feelings unmistakably clear. Their inability to continue insulted the man personally. Political business bent itself around Frederick's obsession in ways that would have been comical if the consequences were not so serious. A Bavarian envoy arrived at Torgau to negotiate a trade agreement that should have required perhaps 2 days of discussion. Instead, 7 uninterrupted hours passed at Frederick's table before the prince would even acknowledge the existence of diplomatic matters. The envoy described how the party ate until speech became difficult, how stomachs protested, how they watched in amazement as Frederick continued consuming food long after everyone else had surrendered. When discussion finally began, most participants were too stupefied by food and wine to think clearly about complex trade terms. The negotiations stretched across 3 weeks, with each day following the same pattern. Meanwhile, religious revolution was tearing through Germany. Martin Luther had challenged Catholic doctrine in 1517, setting in motion events that would split European Christianity and trigger decades of conflict. Frederick's own cousin had chosen to protect Luther from papal and imperial prosecution, making Saxony a center of Protestant reform. Frederick himself watched these momentous developments with the attention of a man whose mind was occupied elsewhere. Religious obligations were fulfilled perfunctorily, services attended when protocol demanded, and theological debates were allowed to rage in the court while genuine passion remained focused on the dining hall. The contribution to the great religious questions of the age consisted primarily of hosting elaborate dinners where Protestant and Catholic advocates could argue across multiple courses, as though sufficient wine and meat might somehow resolve centuries of doctrinal dispute. By the early 1520s, Frederick had become a prisoner of his own body. The palace grounds were rarely left because travel had become physically difficult and the possibility of public embarrassment was dreaded. Servants had to help with dressing because bulk prevented reaching parts of the body. Movement through the daily routine came with labored breathing and visible discomfort. Yet the routine itself never varied. Late mornings brought immediate demands for breakfast. The quantities requested would have fed an entire household for a day. Before that meal was fully cleared, preparations began for the main meal, which started by mid-morning and continued with only brief interruptions until evening. Supper followed, stretching late into the night. Sleep lasted no more than a few hours before darkness brought renewed demands for food. The physicians serving Frederick abandoned subtle persuasion and began speaking bluntly. The current path led to certain death. The stomach, overburdened beyond its capacity, would eventually fail. The combination of weight, age, and eating habits had created a medical crisis that worsened with each passing day. Frederick received these warnings calmly, nodded understanding, and articulated a response that revealed fundamental thinking. A king could not be slave to his own body. Showing weakness at table meant showing weakness in rule. Appetite was a matter between himself and God, subject to no earthly authority. A worldview had been constructed in which continuing to eat represented strength and stopping represented surrender. Summer arrived over Saxony in 1525, bringing oppressive heat that settled across the landscape. Frederick's physicians recognized immediately that the temperature created additional risk. Urgent warnings came that the combination of heat, compromised health, and eating habits had created a genuinely dangerous situation. Frederick dismissed the concerns and announced plans to host celebrations demonstrating Saxon prosperity and power. The festivities would begin in early May and continue for as long as seemed appropriate. Preparations consumed several days. Nobles and dignitaries from across Saxony received invitations they could not refuse. On a Wednesday afternoon in early May, guests began arriving at the Electoral Palace. The feast began with food covering every surface. Roasted swans, whole boars glazed with honey, towers of pastries, fish prepared in a dozen different styles, local and exotic fruits, and wine in staggering quantities. Frederick raised his cup, offered a brief toast, and began eating with the focused intensity that had become his signature. The hours accumulated slowly. Afternoon light gave way to evening shadows. Servants moved constantly, clearing empty platters and replacing them with fresh courses. The other diners ate dutifully at first, then with growing difficulty as bodies protested. One by one they slowed, then stopped, unable to force down another bite. Frederick continued without pause. The eating proceeded methodically, hand moving from plate to plate in steady rhythm. Breathing grew audibly labored. Sweat appeared on the forehead. The court physician noted these signs with professional alarm and approached between courses to speak quietly about the need to rest. Frederick waved him away without breaking rhythm, dismissing the concern as though it were a minor annoyance. Night deepened and eventually gave way to dawn. Most guests had withdrawn hours earlier, unable to remain conscious after such excessive consumption. Frederick had retreated briefly but returned before sunrise on Thursday. Servants who had hoped the feast would end found themselves preparing fresh courses. The eating resumed as though there had been no interruption. The pattern continued through Thursday into Thursday night. Brief rests came, never more than an hour or two, then returns to the table with determination that struck observers as increasingly desperate. Something seemed to be getting proven, though to whom and for what purpose remained unclear. Friday arrived and Frederick remained at his task. The face had taken on a flushed appearance that worried everyone. Movements had become visibly uncomfortable. Constant shifting occurred, and several times a hand pressed against the abdomen as though trying to ease internal pressure. Yet the eating continued. The court physician abandoned diplomatic language and spoke with clinical directness. Frederick's stomach had limits that could not be exceeded safely. The physical dangers were described in plain terms. Frederick listened, appeared to consider the information, then reached for another plate of meat. The conviction was repeated that a king could not be slave to his body, that appetite answered to no earthly authority. Saturday morning revealed the full extent of Frederick's deterioration. The abdomen had swollen dramatically, distending in ways that looked unnatural and alarming. Movement came with obvious pain. Yet when servants set the table, Frederick appeared and began eating with the same mechanical determination shown for days. The physician made one final attempt at intervention, positioning himself directly in Frederick's line of sight and speaking with absolute clarity. The human body has physical limits that exist independent of rank or will. Those limits cannot be overcome through determination or royal authority. Frederick was approaching a point beyond which recovery would be impossible. The plea urged stopping and allowing the stomach time to process what had already been consumed. Frederick listened with what might have been genuine consideration. For a moment, observers thought the warning might actually be heeded. Then another platter was reached for and the familiar declaration repeated. Eating would continue as long as food was placed before him. Appetite was a matter between himself and God. What followed unfolded across several hours that witnesses would remember with horror for the rest of their lives. Frederick continued eating despite growing difficulty. Each swallow appeared to require conscious effort. Breathing had become shallow and rapid. Sweat soaked the clothing. Hands trembled when reaching for food. Yet persistence continued, forcing through course after course. Around midday, as a servant placed yet another platter before him, Frederick suddenly went rigid. The face twisted in pain. Both hands clutched at the massive stomach. A sound emerged that witnesses struggled to describe, something between a gasp and a cry that conveyed shock and agony. An attempt to stand came but the body would not respond. Collapse followed, breathing now coming in short, desperate gasps. The physician rushed forward, calling for help to move Frederick to his chambers. They carried him from the hall, his body limp except for occasional spasms of pain. The abdomen continued swelling, the skin stretched tight and taking on discolored patches. Various remedies were attempted to relieve the internal pressure and ease the pain. Nothing helped. 16th century medicine had no real treatment for what was occurring inside Frederick's body. Drifting in and out of consciousness marked the next several hours. During lucid moments, incoherent mumbling came about the feast, about finishing what had been started, about determination to continue. The words revealed a mind still locked in the obsession. As evening approached, periods of consciousness grew shorter. Breathing became increasingly labored. The physician remained at the bedside, knowing there was nothing more to be done. As evening fell on Saturday, May 7, 1525, Frederick III of Saxony died. The abdomen remained grotesquely distended, a visible testament to what had caused death. The prince who had insisted that no authority could dictate when eating should stop had been overruled by the ultimate authority of biological reality. The physicians examined the body with permission from Frederick's heirs. The stomach had ruptured internally, torn apart by the massive quantity of food consumed over multiple days. The organ remained completely full of undigested material. Meals from Wednesday through Saturday morning had compressed into a space never designed to hold such volume. The surrounding tissues showed extensive damage from the rupture and from the body's failed attempts to process the overwhelming burden. Frederick had quite literally eaten himself to death, determination to continue the feast overriding every signal the body had sent. News of Frederick's death and its cause spread through the German territories with remarkable speed. A prince of the Holy Roman Empire had died because his stomach burst from overeating. The story resonated across different audiences for different reasons. Moralists saw divine judgment against gluttony. Political observers saw commentary on noble excess and detachment from common suffering. Protestant reformers saw evidence of aristocratic corruption. Medical practitioners studied it as an extreme case of ignoring physiological limits. Frederick's successors moved decisively to reshape the Saxon court. The massive stockpiles of food were distributed to the poor, kitchen staff reduced to reasonable numbers, and dining practices emphasizing moderation were instituted. The Great Hall was repurposed for conventional state functions. Official records emphasized early accomplishments as administrator while overlooking the circumstances of the final years. Unspoken agreement held that Saxony's reputation would be better served by minimizing discussion of how the prince had actually died. Yet the story refused to fade precisely because it captured something essential about the dangers of unchecked appetite. Frederick had not been a tyrant in conventional terms. Disastrous military campaigns had not been launched, territories had not been bankrupted through war, subjects had not been systematically persecuted. Self-destruction came through pleasure rather than violence, through consumption rather than conquest. The physicians who had tried to save Frederick incorporated the case into their teaching, ensuring future medical students would understand the absolute physical limits of the human digestive system. The timing of Frederick's death added another dimension to its impact. The year 1525 saw the German Peasants' War raging across the territories. Desperate farmers and laborers, inspired partly by religious reform and partly by economic desperation, had risen in rebellion against noble overlords. Thousands died in the fighting and brutal suppression that followed. Against this background of widespread hunger and desperation, the story of a prince who literally ate himself to death created a contrast so stark that contemporary observers immediately recognized it. Frederick had gorged himself to the point of stomach rupture while his subjects fought over basic survival. The symbolism required no explanation. Modern historians examining Frederick's case have debated the psychological dimensions of his compulsion. Simple gluttony provides an incomplete explanation for behavior so extreme and self-destructive. Some scholars suggest the eating represented an attempt to assert control in a world that increasingly defied understanding. The medieval order that had defined Frederick's youth was crumbling under the pressure of religious reform and social change. Perhaps the table became the one domain where absolute authority could be exercised, where will could remain supreme. Other scholars recognize patterns that mirror addiction more than simple overindulgence. The inability to stop despite clear harm. The prioritization of the compulsion over all other concerns. The denial and rationalization in the face of obvious consequences. These patterns appear consistently across different types of compulsive behavior, suggesting Frederick's eating may have shared more with modern addiction than with mere lack of self-control. The medical reality remains indisputable regardless of psychological interpretation. The human stomach is remarkably adaptable, capable of expanding significantly to accommodate varying amounts of food. But absolute physical limits exist, determined by the strength of muscular walls and the capacity of internal space. When those limits are exceeded repeatedly and dramatically, consequences become severe. The stomach can tear. Rupture allows partially digested food and stomach acid to leak into the abdominal cavity, causing infection and systemic failure. Frederick pushed his body beyond those limits repeatedly across several days. On that May weekend in 1525, the push finally went too far. The stomach ruptured, body systems failed, and death came from the direct physical consequences of eating. Frederick III of Saxony left behind no great monuments, No significant political innovations, no lasting cultural contributions to match those of more accomplished contemporaries. Administration of Saxony was competent but unremarkable. The role in the great religious conflicts of the age was marginal at best. In an era that produced figures like Martin Luther and Charles V, Frederick would likely have been forgotten entirely except for one extraordinary fact: the manner of death preserved the name in historical memory. A medical curiosity emerged, a moral tale about appetite and excess that has continued to resonate across 5 centuries because it speaks to something fundamental in human experience. The lesson Frederick's death teaches transcends its specific circumstances. No title or rank exempts anyone from basic biological reality. Self-destruction can come through pleasure as surely as through violence. Determination and will cannot overcome physical limits that exist independent of human desire. Frederick believed until his final conscious moments that appetite answered to no earthly authority, that a king could not be slave to his body. The ruptured stomach delivered the final answer to that belief. The human body has limits that exist whether we acknowledge them or not. Exceeding those limits carries consequences that no amount of power or privilege can prevent. Frederick III learned this truth too late, and the death stands as permanent testimony to the price of that lesson.